Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, rethinking economics. As I've watched world events unfold this past year, I've been surprised by the many seemingly economically irrational moves that governments and investors around the world are making. The prime examples are coming from the US, with President Donald Trump's trade war or attacks on clean energy. But there are many others. The incredible valuation of AI companies, Argentina's extreme austerity, inclusion of defense companies in ESG funds, the European Union's promise to buy $750 billion of liquefied natural gas. The list is long. Each of these can be explained in different ways. Perhaps it was for a political win, or it was an ideological choice, or short-term thinking, or investments made because of a fear of missing out, or some combination of those excuses. But what if the main reason for these irrationalities is much deeper? That's what Abby Innes thinks. She's an associate professor of political economy at the London School of Economics, and she came to that conclusion while writing her book, Late Soviet Britain. As unlikely as it might seem, her central thesis is that the UK and other capitalist economies are behaving like the ineffective, centrally planned Soviet economy. She argues that the market-driven economic system that was supposed to be the antidote to socialism can never deliver on its utopian promises. Ever since I finished reading the book earlier this summer, I've not been able to stop thinking about it. Though the title refers to the problems in the UK, the conclusions that Abby draws are much more widely applicable. And she arrives at them after studying more than a century of academic work done in economics. The book isn't a light read, but I think it is a necessary read for anyone trying to make sense of the world we find ourselves in. So I wanted to ask Abby to lay out the case she makes in her book and explain why governments and corporations aren't taking the climate threat as seriously as economists think they should. Welcome to the show, Abby.
Thank you very much. Thanks for asking me.
So this is a climate podcast, but folks who work on the climate challenge will fully recognize that we live in a complex, highly connected and interdependent world. And in that sense, any climate solution will involve not just change in technology, but also changes to how government works, finance, society. And your book is focused mainly on government, but on the economy as a whole, and has an intriguing title, Late Soviet Britain. Before we explore the nuances of the work that you've done and the research that led you to write the book, could you just tell us how you started to work on the book at all? And what did you conclude after working on it for many years?
6.5 years, which was quite a lot longer than I thought it was going to take when I started it. So the reason it's ended up with this very counterintuitive title is that when I started working on it, which was after Brexit, what I wanted to write about was state failure. And so I thought, well, I'll begin by looking at the really obvious sort of aspects of that. So I thought I'd start with public sector outsourcing. So the more I looked into that, looking into these contracting failures and enterprise failures, rising costs, declining service quality, and so on, I started to get this very uncanny feeling that it was very familiar to me as someone with a research background in the old Soviet space. I thought, well, this is very strange. Meant to be the opposites, right? The neoclassical economics behind neoliberalism was meant to be as it were, the scientific economics that was the antidote, really, to the kind of central planning bureaucracy and rigidity that we knew about from the Soviet experience. And then I realized that what they held in common was that they were exact mirror images.
So there are plenty of examples, and we'll come to them. One that shocked me as somebody coming to this country as an immigrant and then learning that the country that built the modern sewage system now spills sewage in UK rivers and seas was an interesting experience, but we can come to that failure a little later. there is an aspect of our discussion which is focused on politics separately, economics separately. They are usually not put together, but your area of study is political economy. And you got to the conclusions in the book, which you should briefly mention, through a circuitous route, going all the way back to the philosophy of science. Why was that necessary?
So what I became really interested in was how two ideologies, so neoliberalism in the West and Soviet economics in the East, how they could be rooted in such different metaphysics, as it were. So Soviet economics being rooted in sort of Marxist sociology, which was meant to be dynamic and about moving classes and dynamic social systems, and the mathematical economics known as neoclassical economics, which sits behind most neoliberal policy, which is very much more abstract. It exists in a world of logical argument from assumption using either mathematics or formal logical argument and modeling and forecasting. It's an attempt to build a kind of predictive analytical science. The idea being that you could cut out all this sort of empirical noise and get to, as it were, the universal truths of the economic world. That's the aspiration. And I thought to understand this, to understand how they nevertheless end up converging on the same statecraft of quantification, output planning, target setting, measurement, forecasting, all of this, I'm going to have to go back to the philosophy of science to figure out how they converge. And the point of convergence is that when Stalin moves away from long-term determinism to the idea that you can have a top-down, almost completely encompassing central planning system, you suddenly arrive in a world of attempting to create a perfect coordinating system, a perfect allocative mechanism using planning. And that is the exact mirror image of the aspiration behind neoclassical economics.
How exactly, though? Because you are still in the Soviet system trying to centrally plan for a state that is authoritarian.
That's right.
For socialist outcomes.
That's right.
And on the other hand, the system we live in here in the West now, which has been in place for a while but has been going towards a particular direction, is market-oriented democracies where people are choosing these leaders, and the leaders are saying, we are going to create offers and options for all of you in this competitive space that will allow you to make the best rational choices you are. They seem opposite.
And they are opposite. That's absolutely right. So the book is a kind of dark historical joke in a way, because the argument is absolutely not. It would be absurd to argue that neoliberalism emerged in anything remotely like sort of totalitarian, oppressive, coercive systems, whereas particularly from the Stalinist era onwards, of course, that system is a totalizing regime, very explicitly so. It's extremely violent. It's extremely coercive throughout that period. But the point I want to make in the book is that despite being absolute opposite regimes in political form, the way they think about the economy, the fact that they think about the economy in deterministic machine forms of reasoning means, ironically, that they converge on the same forms of statecraft and reasoning about the economy, which is quantification, target setting, calculation, risk calculation, the idea that we don't live in an uncertain world, but we live in a computable world. And also that if you create systems according to as it were, the science, then enterprises, businesses will only behave in a rational, socially productive manner. And the irony of all of this is that what hyper-neoliberal states like the UK and the US produce is Soviet state failures in capitalist form.
Late Soviet Britain tells me Soviet Union had problems, especially in its late years, because then it went into collapse. And if you are, after 6.5 years, concluding this is where Britain is now, you are saying we are heading towards collapse. But sure, the country has problems, but it's also a democracy. And as far as I know, collapse isn't coming.
I certainly hope collapse isn't coming. Faith in democracy is extremely weak at this point. I think it's fair to say it's weaker than it has been than at any point since the creation of universal suffrage in the UK, and it's an important question as to why that is. And the argument I make in the book is that what has really changed significantly is that the mainstream parties in Britain over the last 45 years have all more or less adhered to a single economic blueprint. There are important differences between Labour and the Conservatives on that, but probably the most important distinction within it is between so-called Camp 1 and Camp 2, or first best world or second best world neoclassical economists. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if you're in the first best world, those positions tend to assume that the more the state withdraws, the more the market is a perfect allocative mechanism, that individuals within market systems are basically rational, that we can navigate our way around highly competitive markets, and that this is the supremely efficient system of allocation in the world and historically. Now, that's, as it were, the radical free market position. Over time, it's become an increasingly dogmatic position.
And that's also from the political perspective, Margaret Thatcher here in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US in the 1980s.
Absolutely.
Trying to bring what is labeled as neoliberal economics to the political sphere.
That's right. They're the radicals in neoclassical economics. But the mainstream position is not really that. Most mainstream economists who work in, companies and government, treasury and so on, tend to be so-called second best world economists. And they are more skeptical of the idealized image or even the possibility of perfectly efficient markets, perfectly rational individuals. However, they maintain the basic methodology, which is the idea that using mathematical modeling and argument from assumption that might be formal prose argument, or it may actually use mathematics, their assumption is that methodology is incredibly useful for figuring out how markets fail. So what they're interested in is using the ideal types, as it were, the perfect markets, the perfectly informed individual, as a heuristic device, as a benchmark, so that you can then develop theory of why markets will fail in practice.
The Thatcher era, you get a ton of privatization because that's the goal of
that
ideology.
Get the state out of the way.
Right. And the water companies are privatized, and, we know what happened to the sewage problem as a result. Railways are privatized. Utilities, parts of them start to get privatized, the power utilities. Then come the Labour years, and they realize not all of that privatization was good, or there are things that the economy hasn't been considering, like greenhouse gases. Labour in the later years puts a price on carbon, on coal specifically, to try and include what later on economist Nicholas Stern labels the greatest market failure, which is taking greenhouse gas emissions outside the economic system, clearly when it has an impact on the economic system. So they try and fix these market failures.
Yep.
But what you're saying is they are still trying to get back to this perfect world of perfect rational people operating in a perfect market, and that would be better for everybody. So there's really not that much difference between the political economy of Labour and Conservatives over the last 45, 50 years.
That's very nicely set out. That's exactly right. And the point I want to make is that Labour and social democratic parties more generally, this is true of the New Democrats in the US, it's true of social democratic parties really across Europe and beyond, found it very appealing, the idea that you could have this kind of technical science of how you would improve markets, that you would get the best of markets and states, that you would use the state only in these efficient ways of mending market failures. But the point I make in the book is that that's a confusion of something that is logically valid with something that you can actually reproduce in the social world, because the fallacy is that by mending a market failure, you're taking society closer towards the efficiency horizon of a perfectly complete market or a perfect system of allocation. And the point I make in the book is that's the Soviet fallacy too. It's the high modernist fallacy that we live in a computable world and perfect efficiency is humanly possible.
If we get all the information, we'll make the right decisions as a result. So talk me through a failure that may explain it. The water utilities here have been privatized. They have been pretty profitable for the shareholders who then took on the ownership of these utilities at the cost, clearly, of service to people, because we have sewage in freshwaters and we have a ton of leaks of freshwater into the pipe system which has been fixed. How exactly do Camp 1, Camp 2 thinking lead to a corporation, a public good that has to be a regulated monopoly if it has to be privately owned, or just a state-owned company, because you can never have competition there happen?
So the sort of idealized version is that markets are always functionally and morally superior to the state, because instead of having the fear being that you would have this kind of monopoly state that would set prices for a nationalized water system, that it would probably overinvest, that it would be this kind of misallocation of resources, that a market system of supply and demand would somehow resolve in a more efficient way. So the assumption being that market provision will somehow be more allocatively efficient. The trouble with things like water and natural resources like that is that they are natural monopolies in terms of provision and supply and the networks that go with it and so on and so forth. But the issue was also that the assumption is that firms of all sizes are, as it were, productive stewards of the real economy. So that even if you had a monopoly firm, the discipline of its wider participation in markets would lead it to invest in a rational way for the long term. This isn't something that's very easy to describe within neoclassical modelling. So the short-termism of shareholders and the idea that they don't, as it were, think in universal welfare improving terms when they think about returns is something that seems to have been missed, but it's been a fairly fatal mistake for us.
So it's a government failure here.
It is.
What could the government have done differently to actually make it work?
So this brings us to the second best world, right? Where these kind of contractual failures or regulatory failures, the assumption is that there must be something in the incentive framework that is inadequate. So you correct the incentive framework. And that's logical. That makes perfect intuitive sense. So you try and do that. You create targets, or you create certain incentives or even disincentives. So you have the threat of fines, for example, or you demand more information. There are all kinds of things you can do to try and sort of correct the framework. What neoclassical models of that cannot begin to describe, though, is the power relationship between a monopoly provider and a government who will be held ultimately legally, fiscally, and politically liable for the non-delivery of that service. So what we see in real historical time is that the British government tries to exert a fine and the regulator makes kind of rude noises to the company, and the company says, well, we realise we've miscalculated in some way and we would pay the fine, but that would rebound on higher bills, or it will restrict our capacity to invest. And it's the investment famine that's been so damaging over time to the nature of the fundamental assets, like the non-building of reservoirs in the UK case. So government tends to retreat because it is caught between a rock and a hard place.
But is there something that you see, or something that you can see in history in the late Soviet Union that you are seeing in today's Britain?
Yeah, I think there are concentrated corporate interests, as there were in the old enterprise planning system of the Soviet Union, the kind of military-industrial complex, if you like, of the Soviet system. But I guess the British system would be a mix of, as it were, the least socially constructive corporate, financial, and fossil fuel interests who are absolutely reactionary, who would rather dig in politically, even if it means the overthrow of British democracy, that like corporate interests and fossil fuel interests supporting Trump in the US, they would rather back an authoritarian to sustain their economic and financial privileges than admit that those privileges have occurred at the exclusion of social cohesion and a sustainable form of economic development. And it's time that they were readjusted and changed and effectively broken up.
It leads to frustration among the public and a desire for a solution and the rise of populism. There is Farage in the UK, Trump in the US, Meloni in Italy, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey. Why is it that their message lands so well? Why is it right-wing populists and not so much left-wing populists who get their message out? Why isn't there like a climate populist?
Well, there's a slightly horrifying analogy with the Soviet system. In the Soviet system, you had decades of trying to mobilize people according to Marxist-Leninist economic promises, right? That in the Soviet space, economies would become more and more wealthy, more and more equal, more and more fraternal, and ultimately the state would wither away and lead to communism, which was like an Edenic condition of a spontaneously fraternal and equal and fair and just and happy society, right? The Thatcherite promise is never that extreme, but it is a promise of the Reagan and the Thatcher revolutions that by removing the state, not completely, but by rolling back the post-war state, by rolling back social democratic values, that all boats would rise on a rising tide continuously. And so we had decades of great economic optimism. But then you get the global financial crisis, which is pretty cataclysmic in terms of the legitimacy and credibility of this system. And that creates a pretty fundamental problem for neoliberal political parties after the global financial crisis, which is how do you continue to legitimize a materialist utopia in non-economic terms? So you do what the Soviets did. And what the Soviets did in the 1980s was increasingly move to nationalist forms of mobilization and racism. So ethnic mobilizations, ethno-nationalist mobilizations. And that's what you're also seeing on the neoliberal right. It's what happened to the Republican Party in the US. It's what happened to the Conservative Party. And I think part of the appeal of ethno-nationalist and racist politics for political parties that don't want to change the economic paradigm fundamentally is you can make huge, expansive promises. You can, as it were, create combat tasks that replace the old economic combat tasks. You can create enemies, foreign and domestic. You can mobilize people. You can divide your societies. It's a wedge issue. And you can do all of this without making a lot of economic promises, except that things will get better, because instead of dealing in an honest way about the failures of the economic paradigm of the last 45 years, it's how much easier to blame it on immigrants or excessive immigration or to resurrect grotesque historic injustices like
or net zero by 2050.
This is fascinating to me, that net zero, instead of taking the science seriously as actual science, but because it had become infected by socialism, right? That socialism had killed the entrepreneurial spirit of the West. That's the argument. And the net zero as socialism argument is a kind of recalibrated version of that. So it's not that there's an objective, empirically verifiable reason to be pretty critical about our current economic status quo. No, it's a socialist conspiracy. So net zero is articulated by, right-wing interests who wish to preserve the privileges that they've gained, and particularly, obviously, sort of carbon fossil fuel interests wish to maintain subsidy and privilege and so on, to reconstitute that argument that this isn't, this science is bogus, this is just socialism under a cloak.
Join us after the break for more of my conversation with Professor Abby Ines, author of Late Soviet Britain. Thank you to everyone who has written a review of Zero recently. We appreciate all of them, and please keep them coming. Recently, Sheila wrote, Zero's crystal clear reporting presented with reflection and serenity must be the best climate crisis information available. Thank you, Sheila. In the climate circles, one diagnosis of the problem that has gained traction recently is that governments, whether left or right, have made it harder to build things. Infrastructure everywhere is creaking.
Yep.
Yeah, it's private companies sometimes that are actually responsible for that infrastructure, like the sewage system here. But it's really governments and their overburdened regulation that has made it obstructionist rather than rules that came from the right place at one point.
Yeah.
This is broadly called the abundance agenda. It's taken off in the US a lot. And the solution is, if only there were fewer regulations in place, we'll all have clean energy, healthy world that we all want to live in. And the left could actually deliver on the promises that the left has made for decades now. And to make it concrete from a climate perspective, it's the idea that even though Joe Biden signed what was the US's biggest climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, by the time the 2024 election rolls around, very little has been built. Not much of the money has been spent. People haven't seen the benefits. So no wonder Trump gets elected. Do you think that diagnosis of the malaise is right?
It's a great question. I think I'd adjust it slightly, which is we have to ask where the regulatory brittleness and complexity came from. And again, it's one of the points of Soviet analogies. So what Soviets and neoliberals both do is try and set up their idealized system of coordination, right? Whether it's the state and command planning in the Soviet system or it's via increasing market power. But what happens next in both systems is that the promises of theory don't play out in practice. So what do? What mechanisms do you have to try and improve the situation? Well, you have the state. And second best world neoclassical economics says what you need to do is regulate them in the forms that would allow them to, as it were, conform more to market theory. So that's what we do. And it's also what the Soviets did in their original central planning system, which is when things don't work the way you're supposed to, what you try and do is build this exoskeleton of more targets, more metrics, more output planning. And the irony in the UK case is we have, after 45 years of marketisation, we have a state that is more centralised, more bureaucratic, more rigid and more expensive than it has ever been historically.
It has more people working for it. The government spends more than when Thatcher took power.
That's right.
This is true not just in the UK, but also in the US, where Reagan promised there will be small government.
Yes.
Government is bigger today and spends way more now. And apart from the one term of Clinton, when deficit actually fell, it has been rising all throughout. So, but the answer of the abundance agenda that we just need fewer regulations, you don't think that's right?
So a simple, a kind of one-dimensional solution like deregulate, it's just, given where we are, I think you just get yet another wave of unanticipated and mostly negative consequences.
There was a simplistic idea, in a way, that was running Camp 1, Camp 2, saying we can create a perfect market economy, shrink the size of the government, and then everybody will be happy. That's not worked out. So now some people are coming in and saying, well, what we need is we've just got too many regulations. Cut those regulations, we'll have a solution. But you're saying simplistic thinking is what got us here. It cannot get us out of this situation.
Right. That's right.
What should we be doing?
I think what's incredibly important, and I suppose what I was aspiring to do in the book, is come up with a diagnosis of how we got here that isn't about sort of, as it were, good people and bad people. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. You have to make a philosophical reckoning. And the philosophical reckoning is, do we think we live in a computable world, or do we think we live in a world of inescapable uncertainty? Do we think the human economy is more like a watch, or do we think it's more like a garden? What sets the natural sciences apart, however, is that outside the social world, it has proved easier to isolate generative mechanisms in certain systems. So having discovered things like thermodynamics or gravity or the way certain chemical compounds combined, we have actually discovered natural laws that are remarkably robust and that give us a basis for further theorizing. What makes that much more difficult in the social world is that there's far greater contingency. Those natural laws don't exist because the agents in the social world are themselves imaginative. We're always, in the social sciences, trying to interpret a world of people who are themselves constantly reinterpreting the world and how they should behave in it. And that level of contingency, that level of complexity, and the fact that the world is always becoming something else socially, means that we need to make, as it were, a far more radical shift than simply a shift in one form of regulation or deregulation. We need to comprehend the fact that we don't live in a computable world. And once you decide that, once you recognize that, it radically, I think, changes the way you think about the economy and the repertoire of potential systems and methodologies that you might use within it.
Are there economies in the world that aren't falling for this problem as the UK and the US have done?
I think you're beginning to see a lot of really interesting experimentation. So when it comes to circular economy ideas, for example, in those countries, Sweden, Holland come to mind. You look at Copenhagen or even Barcelona or Amsterdam, where you still have significant sort of planning capacity within those local city authorities, that they're trying to move quite far in that circular economic infrastructural design. But of course, for already built cities, that can be quite difficult. I mean, I think the fact is you're seeing lots of experimentation, but it's eclectic, as it were. So if you took the idea of public banks, someone like Thomas Marois has written a wonderful book on public banks and is part of a big project with the Canadian government looking at this. Public banks are much bigger players globally than normal financial journalism tends to credit. And I think there's a lot of potential in public banks to mix concessionary and non-concessionary lending to encourage innovation at the not just the firm level, but the technological level and the local authority level. Germany has created, I think, something like 10 new public banks in the last decade. So I think you are seeing countries understanding that short-term financial horizons are just far too short. And what kind of financial organizations would extend those horizons? And public banks, public regional development banks is obviously a way to go. And lots of countries globally have experimented that very productively, I think.
So I wrote a book called Climate Capitalism, which if you only diagnosed on its title,
yes,
from a lefty perspective, that is a paradox. Capitalism and climate change, well, they're opposites. Capitalism caused climate change, so how can it ever solve it?
Yes.
If we took it from your analysis, it may fall in Camp 2 category for most people, which is to say you're tweaking capitalism to be climate-oriented. Mm-hmm. But in fact, when I wrote the book as a journalist, my goal was to try and find examples around the world where climate solutions were scaling.
Yes.
They happened to be in capitalist economies,
yes,
but the routes they were taking to get to those solutions were radically different. The Chinese system is the state-led capitalist economy where they allow for planning for 5-year plans, but they also allow for hyper competition to reach those goals that the state has set. And that's what I found refreshing about your book, which is that you're not, as many people who critique capitalism, just dump the idea, markets can never work, they're useless, they've caused this problem, so think about something else. And we can talk about what the something else that they suggest, which currently doesn't operate at any scale anywhere. But you acknowledge that there are parts of capitalism that are useful, that market economies or marketization of certain things can be useful. Sure, the machine model of the entire economy isn't right.
And it deludes us. It gives us a sort of baseline assumption that firms will always tend to be productive stewards of the real economy. And that assumption that comes out of the machine modeling of neoclassical economics is demonstrably false.
Right.
Sometimes they are, but if you basically do not restrain firms and drive them through regulation, but also culture towards valuable social purposes, they can become incredibly negative actors within the social world. So by being utopian about them, what we've actually done is, as it were, forgotten decades of what we had learned in the pre- and post-war period about how socially beneficial firms could be if they were driven primarily by social purpose, but profit was a secondary priority.
But if the market economy does have utility, these economic models do have utility, what are they? Where are they still useful?
Again, if we think that we live in a garden rather than a watch, I'm going to keep coming back to that analogy. If we think we live in an uncertain world, then we should stop thinking in terms of efficiency and optimality in a presumptively completable machine, because those things are delusions. They're a kind of God delusion. And we should think much more about, well, what are the coordinating mechanisms that we have that would allow us to be continuously adaptive, continuously resilient, continuously able to scan the horizon with the greatest number of alternative perspectives that we can muster. What's a kind of anti-fragile economy under conditions of ecological collapse? And my answer to that would be the most pluralistic range of systems that you have. So that's everything. That's markets, that's firms, but firms much more driven by social purpose than profit. That's the state, but it's also, well, lots of different social forms of cooperation, forms of coordination that are trust-based rather than contract and price-based.
So there is a warning in your book where when you diagnose all these problems, there is clearly temptation to try and break it apart, create a revolution of some sort, which is what happens when, in the Soviet Union, when the social contract was so deeply broken that you had a revolution and then Soviet Union broke apart. But you warn against revolutions because they don't end up creating the kind of solution that the revolutionaries are hoping for.
I'm against revolution if we're talking whole social system revolutions. None of us can know what the correct system is because we're not God. And it is the ultimate virtue of liberal democracies that they are adaptive systems. They allow for learning from your previous mistakes. But they're only adaptive if political parties themselves don't get attached to utopian economic orthodoxies, which then stop them from learning. The other reason that I'm against revolutions is revolutions tend to have revolutionary leaders. I mean, they tend to be deeply undemocratic. And I'm a Democrat. I think the guy who runs a firm or a grocery or the woman running those things, we all have a great deal of knowledge about our own condition. In fact, we have more knowledge about our own condition than anyone else. And the most adaptive, resilient, and knowledgeable system is going to be one that operates in a kind of analytical pluralism in lots of different organizational forms so that all of our knowledge is relevant. That's the most deeply democratic system. And it seems to me inconceivable that we're going to reach a form of society and economics that is compatible with the biosphere if we're trying to impose machine systems or machine thinking or monocultural ideas onto something as beautiful and elaborate and constantly evolving and non-linear and dynamic as the natural world. So we need to think in terms of how do we emulate that world in the way we organize ourselves. Democracy is a pretty good start. Part of what you're talking about is kind of fatalism. And I think a lot of the fatalism in among economic actors, corporate actors, regulators, financial actors even, is the idea that they're sort of cogs in a machine and they can't change the nature of that machine. And we can change it every day. Every day is different. But we need, as soon as we understand that we can change it, that we break known natural economic laws, when we change our minds, when we do things differently, it opens the game in a completely different way.
And the hopeful reading of your book is, to me, empowering because it says we don't have the answer. which is a temptation that so many people have to fall for.
Yeah, isn't it great?
There is intellectual humility in realizing there are deep problems, that we have small solutions, and that all those solutions can be started to work on simultaneously. And it's not starting from zero. Some form of these exist in different parts of the economy around the world, and that they all can start to add up if we reframe the problem at the top, which needs to be addressed. But we don't need the top to go away before we can start to work on those solutions.
That's exactly wonderful. I'm so happy that that's the conclusion that you draw from the book, because it is the one I reached. And also I want to point out that even in the most dramatic social revolutions of the modern era, right, even in the Soviet Revolution and in the collapse of communism and in the Thatcherite revolutions, we think about them as revolutions, but from one day to the next, they were incremental. Right? Real people in the real world from one day to the next are solving the immediate problem they have on their desk with incomplete information, even if they think they're Soviet revolutionaries. And that's one of the main reasons those revolutions tend to go haywire from day two, more or less. That is the human condition. The human condition is we are all attempting to solve the problems right in front of us with incomplete information.
It is true. And even on just objective metrics, which we can take, we live longer lives than we ever have done. We have better medicine than we have ever done. We have technologies now that can start to address the climate problem at prices that, we would be jealous of if we knew in advance that could be reached. And so clearly there are tools as well available to try and solve the problem. So thank you for laying out the problem so clearly and for creating space for everybody to work on solutions.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege to be asked.
And thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That's the sound of sumo. This week, London's been abuzz with the news of the sumo wrestling at the Royal Albert Hall. Only the second time a sumo tournament has ever taken place outside of Japan. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who has witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Eleanor Harrison Tengate, Samar Sadi, Moses Andam, Laura Milan, and Sharon Chen. I'm Akshat Rathi, back soon.